Around 185 BCE, a general killed his own emperor and seized the throne of India. And then, the oldest Buddhist accounts say, he turned on Buddhism itself. He burned its monasteries. He offered 100 gold coins for the head of every monk. There is one problem with that story. The gold coin he supposedly paid in would not exist in India for another 300 years, and the great Buddhist monuments he was supposed to have torn down were being built in stone while he ruled. His name was Pushyamitra Shunga. For 2,000 years, he has been remembered as the man who killed Buddhism in India. He almost certainly did not. And the proof is carved into the very stones he was supposed to have destroyed. To test a story like that, you go to the stones. You go to Sanchi. This dome is Buddhist. It was begun under the Emperor Ashoka in brick. And in the 2nd century BCE, the very century the legend says Buddhism was being torn down, it was not torn down. It was encased in stone, almost doubled in size, and ringed with carved railings. Built, not broken, in the reign of the man accused of breaking it. The texts remember him as a destroyer. The stones from his own age remember something stranger. To understand the accusation, you have to stand in the wreckage of an empire. When the Emperor Ashoka died, around 232 BCE, he left the largest state the subcontinent had ever seen, and one that had been bound, at the top, to Buddhism. Ashoka had carved his edicts into rock, from Afghanistan to the south. He had sent missions abroad. He had made the protection of the Buddhist Sangha a matter of imperial policy. It is easy to forget now. There was an age when the most powerful man in India was a Buddhist. When the edicts cut into the rock, the monuments rising along the roads, and the missions sent to distant kingdoms were all Buddhist. That is the world Pushyamitra was born into, and the world he is accused of bringing to an end. Within 50 years, that empire was coming apart. Weak successors, a treasury drained by a vast bureaucracy, Greek armies pressing in from the northwest, and at the head of what was left of the army stood a Brahmin commander, a Senapati. His name was Pushyamitra. Around 185 BCE, the last Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, held a review of his forces. The court poet Bana, writing 800 years later, so this is memory, not eyewitness, says that Pushyamitra reviewed the whole army, and there, in front of it, killed his master and took the throne. What the new king did next is not in doubt, because a grammarian who lived in his own time recorded it in passing. Pushyamitra performed the Ashokavadana, the Vedic horse sacrifice, a stallion set loose to wander for a year, guarded by soldiers, and any ruler whose land it entered had to submit or fight. When it returned uncaptured, it was sacrificed in public, and the king who had dared the rite could call himself a paramount sovereign. After a century of Buddhist emperors, here was a Brahmin king reviving one of the oldest and most public of the Vedic royal rites and announcing it. You can see how a story might grow in that soil. The story grew in a book called the Ashokavadana, the legend of King Ashoka, itself part of a larger Sanskrit anthology, the Divyavadana. It tells the accusation like this. Pushyamitra, the text says, wanted to be remembered forever. He asked his ministers how. One of them told him the truth he did not want. The Emperor Ashoka had already won eternal fame by building 84,000 stupas across the land. There was no outbuilding Ashoka. So Pushyamitra resolved to be remembered another way. If he could not outbuild the great Buddhist emperor, he would unbuild him. The text is direct about what came next. Here is the translation by the scholar John Strong. Then King Pushyamitra equipped a fourfold army, and intending to destroy the Buddhist religion, he went to the Kukutarama. He destroyed the Sangharama, killed the monks there, and departed. And then, the text says, he marched north and west, as far as Sakala, modern Sialkot, and there he made an offer. He arrived in Sakala and proclaimed that he would give 100 dinara reward to whoever brought him the head of a Buddhist monk, a bounty on monks, the deliberate destruction of 84,000 monuments, a general turning the machinery of the state against a faith. Or so the story goes. This is the story that has come down through the centuries. It is repeated in later texts, a Tibetan history in the 16th century, others before it. It is the story you will find today in textbooks and documentaries and 1,000 arguments online. It is vivid, it is specific, it names a place and a price, and almost none of it survives a close look. Start with when the accusation was written down. The Ashokavadana was not composed in Pushyamitra's lifetime. It was compiled in Buddhist monastic circles somewhere between the 2nd and the 5th centuries of the Common Era, 300 to 600 years after the king it describes. It is not a chronicle. It is devotional literature, written to glorify Ashoka, and a story that glorifies Ashoka needs a villain to set against him. That alone would make a historian cautious, but the text does something that takes it past caution. Look again at the bounty. 100 coins for the head of a monk. 100 dinara. The dinara is a Roman coin, the denarius, and it did not reach India until centuries after Pushyamitra was dead. A king in 185 BCE could not have paid a reward in dinara. The coin did not yet exist here. The word is a fingerprint, and it belongs to the hand that wrote the story down, centuries later, not to the king it accuses. There is more. The same text that condemns Pushyamitra does not appear to know who he was. The Ashokavadana lists Pushyamitra as a Maurya, a descendant of Ashoka's own family, the last of that line. But Pushyamitra was not a Maurya. He was the Brahmin general who ended the Mauryas and founded a new dynasty, the Shungas. A source that cannot place its villain in the right family, on the right side of a dynastic war, is not working from close knowledge of events. And the most telling detail of all, the bounty is not unique to Pushyamitra. The very same texts tell an almost identical story about Ashoka himself. That before his conversion, Ashoka put a price on the heads of followers of rival sects, the Jains and the Ajivikas. The bounty for heretics' heads is a stock device, a literary stamp that could be pressed onto more than one condemned ruler. The historian Etienne Lamotte, who spent a career on the history of Indian Buddhism, weighed the persecution stories against everything else known, and reached a verdict worth quoting exactly. To judge from the documents, Lamotte wrote, Pushyamitra must be acquitted through lack of proof. Acquitted through lack of proof. But there is more than the absence of proof. There is the presence of something else. If Pushyamitra had turned the state against Buddhism, the place to see it would be here, in the Buddhist monuments of his own heartland, a short ride from the Shunga center at Vidisha. And here, in the 2nd century BCE, Buddhism was not being destroyed. It was being built in stone. At Sanchi, Ashoka's modest brick stupa was encased in dressed stone and nearly doubled. A terrace was raised around it for circling on foot. 3 great stone railings went up. 2 more stupas nearby, the second and the third, belonged to the same building age. Not the famous carved gateways, those came later, under the Satavahanas. The older Shunga stone is quieter. The dome, the railing, the terrace, the work of Pushyamitra's century. And the inscriptions on those railings tell you who paid for it, not the crown. The names carved into the stone are merchants, artisans, guilds, and monks and nuns themselves. As royal patronage shifted away, the merchants of a booming economy mattered more. The faith did not collapse, its support spread. Then there is Bharhut, a second great Buddhist monument, its gateway raised by a king named Dhanabhuti, and on it an inscription that fixes the moment in its own words. It opens Suganam Raje. Most epigraphers read it as in the dominion of the Shungas, a Buddhist monument, publicly funded by a king, and, on that reading, dated by its own stone to the rule of Pushyamitra's dynasty. Though I should be honest about the edges of this one. The very scholar who first published it, Alexander Cunningham, read those words differently, as the name of a place, Shrugna, not the Shunga kings. The reading is usually taken as a Shunga era marker. It is not absolute proof, but it points the same way as everything around it. And one more stone, because it shows the colour of the world this king ruled. At Besnagar, beside Vidisha, a pillar still stands. It was raised by a Greek, Heliodorus, ambassador of the Indo-Greek king Antiochus, to the Shunga king Bharhut. And the Greek envoy had it dedicated not to a Greek god, but to Vasudeva, an Indian one. He calls himself a devotee, a Greek, worshipping an Indian god. At the court of the dynasty, the texts cast as persecutors. That is not the record of a closed and burning state. It is the record of a crowded, trading, argumentative one. Now the harder part, the part where this stops being a simple reversal, because none of this makes Pushyamitra a friend of Buddhism. It only means he was not its exterminator. Those are different claims, and the honest one is the smaller. The friction was real. The grammarian Patanjali, living in Pushyamitra's own time, reached for an example of 2 things in permanent opposition, and the example he chose was the Shramana and the Brahmana, the monk and the priest. To him, that rivalry was so obvious it could illustrate a rule of grammar. Though here too, the popular version overreaches. You will often hear that Patanjali compared Brahmins and Buddhists to a snake and a mongoose, locked in mortal hatred. He never wrote it. That vivid image was added by a different commentary 7 centuries later, and later writers fused the two. The enmity was real. The bloodthirsty image was a later embellishment, which is the whole pattern of this story in miniature. And the stones are not entirely on one side either. The archaeologist who mapped Sanchi, John Marshall, believed Pushyamitra was hostile to Buddhism and thought he could read damage to the early stupa into his reign. Romila Thapar, who is among the most careful skeptics of the persecution story, still notes that some Buddhist monuments in the Shunga lands show signs of damage and repair in this period. What almost certainly happened is the quiet thing, not the dramatic one. A king who pulled royal patronage away from the Sangha and poured it back into Vedic ritual. That is real. It is not a genocide. This is also where the argument leaves the ancient world and enters ours. One tradition of scholarship, running through Hariprasad Shastri and, most powerfully, B.R. Ambedkar, reads Pushyamitra's coup as a deliberate Brahmanical counter-revolution against Buddhism. Another, Lamont Thapar Rai Chaudhry, finds the persecution unproven and the texts too late to trust. We are not here to settle a fight that still shapes how people read the past. We are here to show you where the hard evidence runs out and the interpretation begins. You will also hear that Pushyamitra wrote the Manu Smriti, the great Brahmanical law code, to crush the lower castes. He did not. The best dating puts it 2 or 3 centuries later. But that is a story for another film. So did Pushyamitra Shunga kill Buddhism in India? He did not. Buddhism outlived him by more than 1,000 years. It flourished under the Satavahanas, the Kushans, the Guptas, the Palas, and built its greatest universities long after the Shungas were dust. When its decline finally came, it came slowly. The faith drew inward behind monastery walls. It lost its footing among ordinary people. It was absorbed into the wider Hindu world. And its last great institutions in the East were shattered only in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. None of it was the work of one king. That is the real story of how Buddhism left the land of its birth. It is longer and sadder and far less satisfying than a single wicked king. And it is still waiting to be told. But stand at Sanchi in the silence, and the smaller question almost dissolves. Because the thing the legend cannot account for is still standing. The railing a merchant paid for. The stone a king dedicated. The name a monk carved 2,000 years ago, in the reign of the man who was supposed to have hunted him. The story said he destroyed them. The stones are still here.